My brother's fiancée looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You're too poor for our engagement party. Stay home." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her, but the cold smile on her face told me she meant every word. That single sentence replayed in my head for days, louder than any argument we'd ever had, louder than the laughter I used to share with my brother when we were kids. I'm the oldest of three, and growing up, it was always just us and our mom. My father left when I was 12, and from that moment on, life became a series of small sacrifices. My brother, Adam, was only 8 at the time, and our little sister was barely 5. I worked part-time through high school, helped mom with the bills, and learned early how to stretch a single meal into 2. Adam was different. He was charming, confident, and somehow always managed to land on his feet. While I worried about rent, he dreamed about big things. I loved him for that, even if our lives took very different paths. By the time Adam met Sophie, he was already climbing the corporate ladder. Sophie came from money, the kind of money that meant private schools, summer trips abroad, and closets full of designer clothes. The first time I met her, she was polite enough, but I could tell she was studying me. My simple dress, my worn-out handbag, the way I spoke carefully about my job at the local clinic. She nodded, smiled, and said all the right things, but something in her eyes felt distant, like she'd already placed me in a box labeled "not her kind of people." At first, I brushed it off. Adam was happy, and that's all that mattered. He talked about Sophie like she was the answer to every dream he'd ever had. She was beautiful, ambitious, and well-connected. When he told me he was going to propose, I hugged him so tightly I thought he'd crack a rib. I meant it when I said I was proud of him. What I didn't expect was how quickly I'd start to feel like an outsider in his new world. The engagement party was supposed to be a big deal. Sophie's parents were hosting it at their estate, a massive place with white columns, perfectly trimmed gardens, and a driveway longer than my entire street. When Adam called to tell me about it, his voice was full of excitement. He talked about the guest list, the catering, the live music, and how it would be a night to remember. I told him I was happy for him, and I meant it, but I also felt that familiar knot in my stomach. Events like that weren't really my scene. Still, he was my brother. Of course I was going to be there. A few days later, Sophie asked to meet me for coffee. I thought it was a good sign. Maybe she wanted to bond, to talk about wedding plans or family stuff. We met at a cafe downtown, one of those places where the coffee costs more than my lunch. She arrived in a sleek dress, her hair perfectly styled, her phone never leaving her hand. We made small talk at first, but it didn't take long for her tone to change. She leaned forward, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. She said her parents were very particular about the kind of people they invited to their events. They liked things to look a certain way. Then she looked at me, not unkindly, but not warmly either, and said, "I just don't think you'd feel comfortable there." I asked her what she meant, even though my chest already felt tight. That's when she said it, clear and sharp. "You're too poor for our engagement party. It would be better if you stayed home." I didn't know what to say. My face burned and my hands felt shaky. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to pretend it was a joke, but she didn't smile. She went on about how the guests would be high profile, how the atmosphere would be very upscale, and how she didn't want anyone to feel out of place. It was like she was doing me a favor, like she was protecting me from embarrassment. I nodded, paid for my coffee, and left before she could say anything else. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window and tried to swallow the lump in my throat. I'd spent my whole life working hard, taking care of my family, and never asking for much. I didn't think I deserved to be treated like a problem that needed to be hidden away. The worst part wasn't even what Sophie said. It was the thought of how Adam would react if I told him. Would he defend me, or would he agree with her? That night, I called my mom and told her everything. She was furious, but also worried. She didn't want this to cause a rift between me and my brother. She reminded me how excited Adam was about the engagement and how stressed he already seemed with all the planning. Maybe she didn't mean it the way it sounded, Mom said gently, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. For a few days, I said nothing to Adam. I went to work, smiled at patients, and pretended everything was normal. But inside, I felt smaller than I ever had before. Every time my phone buzzed, I wondered if it was him, if he was going to ask why I hadn't responded to the invitation yet. When he finally called, his voice was cheerful. He talked about suit fittings, menu tastings, and how Sophie was handling everything. I told him I was busy, that I wasn't sure about my schedule, and he didn't push. The night before the party, I sat on my bed and stared at the simple dress I'd planned to wear. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and neat, and I felt good in it. I imagined walking into that grand house, seeing Adam smile, and reminding myself that I belonged there because he was my sister, not because of my bank account. But Sophie's words echoed in my head, and the confidence I had built up slowly crumbled. In the end, I didn't go. I sent Adam a short message saying I wasn't feeling well. He replied with a sad emoji and told me he'd call me the next day. When I saw the photos online of Sophie in her stunning gown and Adam in his tailored suit, surrounded by smiling guests and sparkling lights, I felt a mix of pride and pain. My brother looked happy, truly happy, and I didn't want to take that away from him, but I couldn't ignore the fact that I'd been pushed out of one of the most important moments of his life. What I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. Sophie's words weren't just an insult, they were a warning, and the choices I made next would change my relationship with my brother forever. The morning after the engagement party, Adam called me like he promised. His voice was tired but cheerful, the kind of tired that comes from a night of celebration. He told me the party was amazing, how everyone loved the food, the music, and the decorations. I congratulated him again and asked about Sophie. He said she was thrilled, already talking about wedding plans and guest lists. For a moment, I considered telling him the truth, but the words got stuck in my throat. I didn't want to ruin his happiness, especially not over something that might seem small to him. A few weeks passed, and life went back to its usual rhythm. I worked long shifts, helped Mom with errands, and tried not to think about what had happened. But Sophie didn't let it go. She started making comments whenever we crossed paths at family gatherings. She'd compliment my outfit in a way that felt more like a reminder of what I couldn't afford, or she'd casually mention expensive venues and designers, always with that subtle tone of superiority. Adam never noticed, or maybe he chose not to. The real turning point came when wedding planning kicked into high gear. Sophie invited Mom and I to a planning lunch with her and her mother. The restaurant was fancy, but I went anyway, hoping things might finally feel more inclusive. Instead, the lunch turned into another reminder of where I stood. They talked about destination venues, luxury hotels, and guest lists that seemed to stretch into the hundreds. When Mom suggested a smaller, more intimate option to save money, Sophie's mother laughed softly and said, "Oh, we don't really worry about that." At one point, Sophie looked at me and asked what I thought. I hesitated, then said I just wanted Adam to be happy. She smiled and replied, "Of course, but happiness looks different for everyone." The way she said it made me feel like my version of happiness didn't quite count. Later that week, I got a message from Sophie. She said she needed to talk to me about something important. My stomach dropped as I read it. We met again, this time at her parents' house. The place was just as impressive as I remembered, all marble floors and towering windows. Sophie led me to a quiet sitting room and closed the door behind us. She didn't waste time with small talk. She told me that for the wedding, they were keeping the guest list very exclusive. She said it was about image, about making sure everything felt cohesive. Then she paused and looked at me with that same calm, almost kind expression she'd used before. She said, "I don't think it would be appropriate for you to attend. It's not personal, it's just about the vibe." This time, I didn't feel shock. I felt anger. My brother's wedding, one of the biggest days of his life, and I was being told I didn't fit the vibe? I asked her if Adam knew about this. She said he trusted her judgment on these things. That was the moment something inside me broke. It wasn't just about the party anymore. It was about being erased from my own family's milestones. When I got home, I cried harder than I had in years. My mom tried to comfort me, but I could see the hurt in her eyes too. She felt just as unwelcome as I did, even if Sophie hadn't said it outright. After a long, sleepless night, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. Adam deserved to know the truth, even if it caused tension. I asked him to meet me for lunch, just the two of us. We went to a small diner we used to visit when we were kids, a place that still smelled like coffee and fried eggs. When he sat across from me, smiling and talking about wedding details, I almost lost my nerve. But then I remembered Sophie's words and the way she'd looked at me like I was a problem to be managed. I told him everything. About the coffee meeting, the engagement party, the planning lunch, and the message about the wedding. At first, he looked confused. Then his smile faded, replaced with a tight, uncomfortable. This time, I didn't feel shock. I felt anger. My brother's wedding, one of the biggest days of his life, and I was being told I didn't fit the vibe? I asked her if Adam knew about this. She said he trusted her judgment on these things. That was the moment something inside me broke. It wasn't just about the party anymore. It was about being erased from my own family's milestones. When I got home, I cried harder than I had in years. My mom tried to comfort me, but I could see the hurt in her eyes too. She felt just as unwelcome as I did, even if Sophie hadn't said it outright. After a long, sleepless night, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. Adam deserved to know the truth, even if it caused tension. I asked him to meet me for lunch, just the two of us. We went to a small diner we used to visit when we were kids, a place that still smelled like coffee and fried eggs. When he sat across from me, smiling and talking about wedding details, I almost lost my nerve. But then I remembered Sophie's words and the way she'd looked at me like I was a problem to be managed. I told him everything. About the coffee meeting, the engagement party, the planning lunch, and the message about the wedding. At first, he looked confused. Then his smile faded, replaced with a tight, uncomfortable expression. He said Sophie didn't mean it like that she was just stressed and particular about details. I asked him if he thought it was okay for his own sister to be excluded because of money. He didn't answer right away. The silence between us felt heavy. Finally, he said he'd talk to Sophie. He promised me he would. I wanted to believe him, but something in his voice felt uncertain, like he was already preparing to choose a side. A few days later, he called me again. His tone was serious. He said Sophie felt misunderstood, that she never intended to hurt my feelings, but she also believed her parents had the right to decide who attended their events. He said he loved me, but he didn't want to start his marriage with conflict. Hearing that hurt more than any insult Sophie had thrown at me. It felt like I was being asked to quietly accept my place in my brother's life. That night, I sat alone in my room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head. I wasn't jealous of Sophie's wealth or her lifestyle. I just wanted respect. I wanted my brother to stand up for me the way I'd always stood up for him. Instead, I felt like I was being asked to disappear for the sake of someone else's comfort. The next message I got from Sophie was short and cold. She said the situation was unfortunate, but hoped I would understand. That was it. No apology, no effort to make things right, just a polite dismissal. For the first time, I stopped trying to make things easier for everyone else. I started thinking about myself, about my worth, and about what it meant to be part of a family. I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting anyone. It was only allowing me to be pushed aside. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Sophie define my place in my brother's life anymore. Whatever happened next, I was ready to face it, even if it meant changing our relationship forever. The weeks leading up to the wedding were tense, even from a distance. Adam and I spoke less often, and when we did, our conversations felt careful, like we were both avoiding landmines. I focused on my work, throwing myself into extra shifts and volunteering for projects, anything to keep my mind busy. But underneath it all, I felt a steady determination growing. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired of being invisible. One evening, my mom sat me down and told me something that changed everything. She said Sophie's parents had been asking questions about our family, about our background, our finances, even our old... The weeks leading up to the wedding were tense, even from a distance. Adam and I spoke less often, and when we did, our conversations felt careful, like we were both avoiding landmines. I focused on my work, throwing myself into extra shifts and volunteering for projects, anything to keep my mind busy. But underneath it all, I felt a steady determination growing. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired of being invisible. One evening, my mom sat me down and told me something that changed everything. She said Sophie's parents had been asking questions about our family, about our background, our finances, even our old neighborhood. They wanted to know where we came from, as if we were a business deal instead of people. Hearing that made my chest ache, but it also made me see the situation more clearly. This wasn't just Sophie's attitude. It was the world she came from, a world that valued appearances over connection. Instead of confronting Sophie again, I decided to take a different approach. I reached out to Adam, not to argue, but to remind him of who we were. I sent him old photos of us as kids, standing in front of our tiny apartment, laughing with ice cream on our faces. I reminded him of the nights we shared one blanket to stay warm, the way we promised to always have each other's backs. I didn't accuse him of anything, I just told him I missed him. At first, he didn't respond. Then, a few days later, he called me. His voice sounded softer than it had in weeks. He said he'd been thinking about everything I told him, about our childhood, about how much Mom and I had sacrificed for him. He admitted he'd been so focused on starting a new life that he'd ignored the people who helped him get there. The wedding day came, and I still wasn't invited, but this time it didn't feel like a rejection. It felt like a choice I was making for myself. Instead of sitting at home feeling sorry for myself, I spent the day with Mom. We cooked our favorite meal, watched old movies, and laughed about memories that had nothing to do with wealth or status. For the first time in months, I felt peaceful. That evening, Adam showed up at our door, still in his suit. He looked exhausted, but there was something else in his eyes too, something like regret. He told us the wedding was beautiful, but also overwhelming. He said he couldn't stop thinking about the fact that his own family wasn't there to share it with him. Sophie had been focused on every detail being perfect, but in the process, something important had been lost. He apologized to me, really apologized, not with excuses or explanations, but with honesty. He said he should have stood up for me, that he should have made it clear I belonged, no matter what. Hearing those words didn't erase the pain, but it softened it. I told him I didn't need fancy parties or grand gestures, I just needed to know I mattered. Over time, things slowly changed. Sophie and I never became close, but she stopped making comments about money or appearances. Adam made more of an effort to include us in his life, visiting often and checking in like he used to. Our relationship wasn't exactly the same as before, but it was more honest. Looking back, I realized something important. Being too poor for someone's party didn't mean I was too small for their life. My value was never measured by what I owned, but by who I was and the love I gave. I learned to stop shrinking myself to fit into spaces that didn't want me, and to focus on the people who truly saw me. In the end, Sophie's words didn't break me, they reminded me of my strength. And while I didn't get an invitation to a fancy engagement party or a luxury wedding, I kept something